Well, good morning, everyone. Indeed, a beautiful morning. I have a few things that I would like to share before I get into the message. And one is this. On this day in 586, the Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple, August the 9th in 586 BCE, or before the Common Era. On this same date, calendar date, August 9th, in 70 CE, or Common Era, the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem by the Romans, both of them the 9th of August. I don't know if you knew that or not, but I find it, is it coincidental? Probably not. I'll be sharing a number of things this morning. And one thing that I would like to share, I think I did bring it along. Yes, I did. Is this past week, in fact, it was yesterday, I got a newsletter from Ed Heinzen, if you know who Ed Heinzen is, who is he is a professor, and I think he's director of the seminary at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. And this is what he had to say in his newsletter. Many are confused, asking what's happening to our country. Where did all this begin? Why are we so divided? Let us begin by examining the root cause of the current chaos in the 19th century. Then Princeton theologian Charles Hodge warned that when American education ceased to be distinctly Christian, it would only remain neutral, non-Christian, for a while, then ultimately turn to decisive anti-Christian within 100 years. And his prediction was this: the secularization of America has increasingly grown into a stronghold on public discourse. 60 years after the ruling of no public praying in school, the secular idea is secularism is that there is no God, relativism, there is no truth, selfism, I am all that matters, materialism, give me more stuff, and mysticism, redefine reality. That is where we are today. It was also by one of the leading people in America who at one time was in public office, who is saying that we need to, instead of paying attention to the things that are going on in the world today, that we might direct our thinking and our efforts toward climate change, whatever that's supposed to mean. So, as though we could control the weather, I guess. But I do believe that we're living in a time of, and I realize that I myself am somewhat uneasy sometimes, and sometimes wondering what is going on in our country today or in the world. I am expecting something to happen. Simply put, I don't know what. I am not here to set times, dates, or anything of that nature. But I do believe that there is something unusual and something in the making. When I look at the situation in the Middle East, all the threats, all the things that are going on there, I don't know what to make of it, but I do believe probably before this year's end, there are some things going to transpire that are going to be world shaking. Whether I'm right or not, I'm not going to be that dogmatic that I'm not open to change. But I do see some things that are leading up to uh, some end time events, and one of the things I see is in the monetary situation that there are banks in this, even in America today, who do not have cash. They do not have a checking account. Everything is just number transfers, and you couldn't go to the bank. Those banks, I think they're in the New England states, some of them. You couldn't go to cash a check because they have no cash. You couldn't open a checking account because they have no checking account. And I think the whole thing is a forerunner of some of the things that are going to transpire in the future. And I thank you, Paul, for what you have mentioned in your call to worship. Paul had asked me what he should read, and I told him I don't know what to tell you. And somehow the Lord laid this on his heart, and it was exactly the introduction that I needed for this message this morning. But there are some things that are shaping up fast. I know I'll not get through with everything I wanted to share this morning. But I do remember as a young person, I'm not sure how old I was, I might have been 14. I know I wasn't 15 yet. That for some reason one evening I picked up a Bible, and it was not, I believe at that time in our home, in our church, the Bible was not taught the way I understand it today. It was more a book of rules, a book of things that need to be practiced and kept. And there was not much, no emphasis on a relationship with Jesus Christ. And we did have a neighbor who was an old order Amish preacher. And he and I spent a lot of time together discussing things. He has since passed on to his reward. But he was very interested in prophetic passages, and we discussed them a lot. And he started preaching them in his church. And they finally told him to stop preaching his prophetic stuff. And what they really wanted is what the new rules were for us. And of course, he didn't succumb to that, but he told me that he needs to stick with the word. And so, coming to that, when I was about 14, one evening I sat down and I read through the entire book of Revelation. I did not understand it. I had no idea what it was talking about, but I was fascinated with the message. And I started reading at chapter 1, and before I went to sleep that evening, I had read through the entire book of Revelation. And I know that there were times when I looked at some of these things and I wondered why, and I probably even shed some tears over the things that were going to come into this world. And this morning I want to share my primary messages. I want to show the significance and the similarities between Matthew 24 and the book of Revelation, beginning at chapter 6. I know that there are many interpretations on this. There are those who have the historical view of the book and believe that most of the book of Revelation is already fulfilled. And some of them have used the destruction of Jerusalem has become somewhat of a depository, or it might have been, you call it maybe like if you don't know where to put it, you put it to the destruction of Jerusalem. There is the historical view of it. and that it has all been fulfilled except about the last two chapters. Well, I do not see it that way. Then there are also many other views about even in the entire scriptural interpretation of the Bible. And I do believe that one of the greatest damages that has been done was in 300 AD or 300 BC, when a man by the name of Origen came up with the idea of the allegorical method of studying the Bible. That you don't take anything literal. It is only an allegory. In other words, the story of Jonah and the whale may not have ever happened. It is an allegory, and we need to learn from it. And I know one man, he came to our community from a different community who was teaching on some of these subjects. And he used the allegorical method of interpreting the scriptures. Such passages as Isaiah 11. That this is not actually will not literally take place, but it's an allegory, and we need to learn what he is talking about. And this person was saying that he believes that when he talks about the animal kingdom in Isaiah 11, Isaiah 65, that has to do with we as believers need to understand how to get along with communism and fit in. There are some things, some of these interpretations have borderline the ridiculous, if not completely there. Then there are also these other theologies about we're living in a time of the kingdom now. In fact, I sat across the table from a person who was under this persuasion, and he asked me, "Are we in the 1,000-year reign now?" And I said, "No." He said, "What makes you think we're not?" I said, "Because it simply does not fit what the conditions are going to be like there." And I will say this, and when I was studying about this, I turned my radio on, and it just happened to come up where David Jeremiah was teaching on this, and David Jeremiah asked the question, if we're in the kingdom now, is this as good as it's ever going to be? Will it never be any better than this? Well, if I read through Isaiah chapter 11 and Isaiah 65, I find that things are going to be a lot better then than what they are now. And I asked this guy, I said, would you feel comfortable with having your children out in the lawn playing with poisonous snakes? Well. And one person said, the 1,000-year reign started at the time of Christ. Well, that was 2,000 years ago. And he said, if you want to know the answer, Peter said, one day with the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. He said, that is the answer. So if we apply that to everything in the scriptures, the 6 days of creation could have been 6,000 years. And there are some things that just replacement theology, kingdom theology, and whatever you have has brought a lot of confusion into our time and into our approach of the scriptures. And I believe that our position that we have on eschatology, teaching about last things, has a great bearing on how we interpret the rest of the Bible. A number of years ago, I was sitting with a group of ministers, and I asked a simple question. And I simply asked the question now. I said, would you guys help me in this or making a study of this? Will there ever be a time when we will come back to the earth and Jesus Christ will reign? And believe me, I heard it. And finally, I thought, this is kind of fun. So I started asking questions. And one of the first things he asked me, well, I have a question for you. He said, did you read the Left Behind series? And I said, sorry, no, I did not. But I do read about the Left Behind in the Bible. I don't have to read that book. Then he said, I'll have you to know that Abraham had more than one son. And I said, I understand that. But he only had one son of promise. And when the time came for Abraham to die, Isaac was the heir, and to the rest of them that he had was his second marriage, got gifts. And I said, also, the promise to Abraham of the land from Genesis 12 was confirmed to Isaac, to Jacob, and it went down the line. And interesting, we had a very interesting discussion. But then he informed me, he said that my father was a pastor for 52 years. And he never one time preached on end-time events, on eschatology. And I almost said, have mercy on that congregation, but I didn't. I thought there's no point in all those kind of, I felt almost like I would have been throwing dirt. You know what I mean? And that is not what the Bible is all about. But the setting of this message this morning is, and I already know I'll barely have the introduction to it. But the setting of it was when after Jesus was rejected by the Jewish leadership, when he came at the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and when he gave them a parable in Matthew 22 about the invitation to the wedding feast. And I hardly have time to turn to it, so I'll just say a few things about it. But the invitation went out, and these people refused to come. He sent a second group of people to give the invitation, and yet they didn't come. He said, all right, you go out to the highways, the hedges, invite anybody. Just ask them to come. And what I think what Jesus was saying there was to his own people. When John the Baptist came on the scene, he preached repentance. When Jesus started preaching, he preached repentance. And he sent out his disciples. He said, don't go into the way of the Gentiles. He said, I'm not come but unto the house of Israel. When he went to the house of Israel, they rejected him. They decided we don't need this person. They condemned him by false accusations. And when he was crucified, they decided we're rid of him. And they forgot the resurrection. Because of that, of their rejection, the Gentiles were grafted in. And the message went out to them. So the two groups that were sent out to invite the Jewish people were when Jesus taught, when John the Baptist taught. The preaching of the early church was the next invitation, and they rejected that. Even though the first groups that included the church, the establishment of the church, were Jewish. And then the message went out to the Gentiles. And it was James who understood what was going on. And when the question came up about receiving Gentiles into the church, James got up and went to the Old Testament, to the book of Amos. And he said, to this agree the prophets, that after this I shall return and build again the tabernacle of David, which is fallen down. There will be a time span when he will build his church. until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And I think we're very close to that point. We're very close. In fact, but I'm not here to set dates. But we read through the Old Testament, and I constantly marvel at this, that the prophets who came and preached were Jewish. Their ministry was in Judea, Samaria, and Jerusalem, in Israel. They preached to the Jewish kings. They were sent as God's representative. The prophet in the Old Testament was God's representative to the people, different from the priest. The priest represented the people before God. And this is what Jesus is doing now. The difference between a prophet and a priest. And we notice that in Zechariah, there will come one as a priest king and will sit on his throne. There was never a man in the Old Testament that possessed all three offices of prophet, priest, and king, except Jesus Christ. He came as prophet in his first coming. He is interceding for us as priest. He is representing us before God. And when he comes the second time, he will come as our king, as our reigning king. He's prophet, he is priest, and he is king. And when the tabernacle was constructed, that the glory of God came down and filled the tabernacle. Later, when the temple was dedicated under King Solomon, the glory of God came down and filled the tabernacle, the temple, so that nobody could even enter. And by the time we get to Ezekiel chapter 8, we find that because of Israel's sin, God withdrew his presence from the temple and left by way of the mountain to the east. There is no record of any appearance of the glory of God from there on in the temple until Jesus came and he wept over the city of Jerusalem. And he said, if you would have known this, your day of visitation, but now your house is left to you desolate. It's empty. The glory and presence of God is not there. They didn't know the time of his visitation. It was the 72nd week, or the 62nd week of the 70 weeks of Daniel, to the very day that Jesus was there. The presence of God was back in the person of Jesus Christ, and they failed to recognize him. And he said, you shall not see me henceforth till you shall say, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. In Hosea chapter 5, it is said, I will go to my place until they acknowledge their iniquities. And then they're going to cry out for the Messiah to come. And Jesus will not come until they want him to come. So, several years ago, I don't know what year it was, I did a paper on Matthew 24 and comparing with Revelation chapter 6. If you have your Bibles, turn to Matthew 24, put a finger there, and turn to Revelation 6, and put your other finger there. And we'll be going back and forth for a little bit. I wish we had time to fully develop this. And by the way, if somebody wants a copy of this, you're welcome to have it. It's not copyrighted. Maybe it's not totally accurate, everything. I'm not infallible. But if you want a copy of this, just let me know. I'll see to it that you get one. By the way, I will not be here next Sunday. I was asked to speak at another church that have an outing, a picnic, church picnic, and they asked me to be their speaker. So I guess I'll be going there next Sunday. But one of the first things that Jesus informed them was when they asked about when they sat out on the Mount of Olives. And in fact, we could do an entire sermon on the Mount of Olives and the things that transpired out there. When we were in Israel, I sat out by the wall, and I didn't care. I wouldn't have cared at that time if I wouldn't gone anywhere with the tour group. I just wished I had a chair. I would like to sit here and just meditate all day on the Mount of Olives and what transpired out there. You could see the Dome of the Rock where the old temple you stood. You could see the area around it. And in my mind, I just wondered what it would look like. The old Roman road is still there. Probably the very stones that Jesus rode past from the Mount of Olives, down past the Garden of Gethsemane, across the Kidron Valley, up the slopes, eastern slope of Jerusalem to the temple area. I just wanted to picture in my mind, what did this look like? People lining up and say, Hosanna. In other words, they were saying, save now, is what it meant. They were not asking to be born again. This was farthest thing from their mind. What they were wondering is, here's this king who is riding in Jerusalem, who's going to take care of the Roman guards, the Roman government, and he's going to set up rule right now. And Jesus spoke about that in Luke 19:11. There were those people present who thought that the kingdom would appear immediately. And then Jesus gave them a parable, and so they understood what was going on and what was happening. And that the kingdom had been delayed by 7 years because the Jewish leadership rejected him as their Messiah. So they asked him, they told him, hey, just look at these stones. Just look at the temple. Just look at this beautiful edifice here. And it was said, it was one of the 7 wonders of the world. And it was said, if you have not seen the temple, you have not seen beauty. And it is said, when the sun arose and was shining on the temple, the gold reflected to the point where you couldn't even look at it. It was that bright. And he said, now, Jesus said there's not going to be one stone left upon another that shall not be torn down. And he said, now tell us, what shall be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world? And then, beginning in Matthew 24, he told them what is going to take place. In fact, it was also spoken of in the by the prophet Zechariah. And just a few notes here. And I see the time is already up, and I didn't really get to the message. But some of the things that happened during the time of the Babylonian captivity, when the temple was destroyed, where Jeremiah in the book of Lamentations writes about it. And the things were so terrible that he talked about the pitiful women who had sodden and eaten their own children. It was that bad. When Herod's temple was destroyed in Jerusalem, and Josephus writes about this, that when the Romans came and surrounded the city, nobody could go in, nobody could come out. They cut off all food supplies. And the hunger was so great that people actually butchered and ate their own children for survival. It was that bad in Jerusalem. After Jesus went back to heaven, he gave them, as long as there were Jews, there was Judaism. And when Jesus went back to heaven, he gave them an entire generation to set from 30 some to 70 AD to make the transition from law to grace. And it didn't happen. And the city of Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. And one of the first things that he tells them is this, and I'll say a few things about this, and then I'll come to a close. I guess my next message, I'm going to finish it. Finish what I hadn't got hardly started yet, is what it amounts to. But Jesus told the Jewish leadership in John chapter 5, he said, I came in my Father's name, and you didn't believe me. There's one who will come in his own name. Him you will receive. You'll believe him. They didn't believe where he came from. He said, I came down from heaven, from my Father. They didn't believe him. Show us the Father, and it satisfies us. He said, all right, what will you say? Will you see me go back to where I was before? What will you say then? And they decided this man needs to be killed. But the first thing that he mentions here, and I'll just mention a few things, then I'll close. Beware that no man deceive you. Many shall come in my name and believe and try to teach you that they are Christ. You're not. I have people that came to my mind there were people in our lifetime. I don't know if some of us are not old enough to remember, or probably a few remember Father Divine. Remember that name? From New York, who claimed to be a Messiah. It was probably during the close to the end of World War II. And people would come from a great distance to listen to Father Divine, who claimed to be a Messiah. There were the Koresh people in Texas. We remember him. David Koresh, who claimed to be a Messiah. Had a great following. There was Rabbi Schneerson from New York. While he did not make that claim for himself, there were some of his Jewish friends who tried to make him out as the coming Messiah. There was Jim Jones, who led a group to Guyana and had a mass suicide of his followers, claimed to be their Messiah. And if we read into the background of many of these people who established cults, were at one time Bible-believing people. Which Jim Jones was. He lost his faith, gave up his faith in God, and declared himself to be a Messiah, and deceived a lot of people with him. And the first warning that Jesus gives is, beware that no man deceive you. Deception is such a terrible thing. When the person thinks that he is right and he is wrong, it is terrible. I'll just give one illustration and I'll close. We were driving one night, rainy night, foggy, nasty, coming up from Harrisonburg, Virginia, wanting to get onto Route 40 and head west. I was driving. The rest of them, I think, were all sleepy. I made a wrong turn. And I got to a point where it said Baltimore, so many miles. And I decided, I know which way I'm going. That sign must be wrong. Yeah, those things happen when you're convinced you're right. And finally I decided, well, I'd better pay attention to the sign. I was sure I was right, but I was wrong. I was wrong. It was hard to convince me. And I believe that this is where people get to when they reject the truth. And this is where we get to when we read in 2 Thessalonians 2. God gave them over to a reprobate mind when they reject the truth. And they started to believe that which is wrong to be right. I'll need to close there. I'll finish this some other time. Thank you.